To build a model of the overall economy, we need to focus on certain variables, certain macroeconomic variables. And we're going to discuss four which economists tend to focus on. Of course, there's many others, but these capture a lot of the important movements in the economy that need to be considered to understand what's going on in recessions and recoveries and in longer periods of economic growth. The first one is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, of course, is trying to measure how much unemployment is in the economy, how many people are unemployed. It has a particularly precise definition, however, and that is a fraction of the labor force that is unemployed. The labor force itself is defined as the sum of people who are either employed or who are looking for work. So it's either employed or looking for work, and then you're in the labor force. The measure of employed and looking for work is based on a survey the government has of households around the country. They give a sample of people, and they go to knock on the doors and say, "Are you employed?" And if the person says no, and they say, "Are you looking for work?" And if they say yes, then that person's considered in the labor force. But if they ask that person if you're looking for work to another person, if they're looking for work, and they say no, then that person's not in the labor force. So to be in the labor force, you not only have to have a job, which is kind of obvious, you'd be in the labor force, but you have to be looking for work. And once you add those two together, you get this labor force. Of course, you can imagine just from this example of the government surveyor asking if someone's looking for work, it's somewhat in the eye of the beholder. For example, you could imagine someone, maybe an older person around 50 or 55 who was laid off from a job and has spent a year or 2 years looking, and then finally says, just gives up, we're just going to just stay at home. Then that person literally drops out of the labor force because they're not looking for work. It's not counted in the labor force, but you could imagine, well, in some sense, they're kind of looking for work. They just got tired and are doing some other things. So it's really somewhat ambiguous, this definition of the labor force, but nonetheless, you have to have something like that in order to properly measure the amount of unemployment in the economy. After all, if you're a student taking a full-time course load, you're neither employed nor looking for work. And so you don't want to think of that person as being unemployed or doing something else. Or if you are a 75, 80-year-old retiree, you're neither employed or you're looking for work. So you don't want to count that person as unemployed as well. So it's important to make this correction. It's just difficult to do. Once you've made the correction, then you can go about and actually compute the unemployment rate. And let's consider an example of that. Let's consider an example of people in September 2013. I'm going to measure people in millions. So for example, in September 2013, there were 246.2 people in the non-institutional population 16 and over. So 16 and over people not in institutions is 246.2. Institutions like jails, for example, 246.2 million. The labor force at that point, again, remember the sum of employed plus looking for work people, was 155.6 million. Of those, from this survey, the government was able to determine that 144.3 were employed and 11.3 were unemployed. We know also that 90.6 million were not in the labor force at all. They were part of the population 16 and over, but they were neither employed nor looking for work. To get the unemployment rate, therefore, you divide the 11.3 by 155.6 millions. You get a fraction, 0.7, and report that as a percentage, which is about 7%. So that's the unemployment rate. Sometimes economists also look at a different measure, just looking at the total amount of employment compared to the population. So in this particular case, you have total employment is 144.3. The population is 246.2. The ratio of those is 58.6. That measure is sometimes more useful because it doesn't rely on this difficult determination about whether someone is in the labor force or not, whether someone is looking for work or not. This issue has become particularly important in recent years because it appears that quite a few people have dropped out of the labor force because of tough economic times. and so they're not counted as unemployed, even though they're effectively, maybe lost a job and they look for work for a while and they're not looking, they're no longer counted as unemployed. So the unemployment rate is probably too low because of that, and economists like to look at other measures like employment to population to really get at least an alternative measure, if not a better measure. So having described how the unemployment rate is calculated, let's look at what happens to it over time and how that relates to these recessions and recoveries that we've talked about. So this is a picture of the unemployment rate going back to the 1940s in the United States, and you can see on the vertical axis we have rates ranging from under 3% in the early 1950s to over 10% in the early 1980s, and getting to those high levels again, 10% or so in the 2007-2009 recession. In every recession, unemployment rate increases, and you can see that quite clearly. That was a gigantic jump in unemployment in the period of the most recent recession, jumped up in all these recessions here quite a bit, and then in the recovery it starts to come down. So that's a pattern which is universal. Any model that we have of the economy has to take that into account, has to explain why unemployment goes up in a recession. Why do people lose their jobs? What is it that generates this behavior? But also note there's sort of longer term trends in unemployment. As you look through this, it's sort of just kind of going up in this area. It's coming down in this period of time, kind of going up again. So on top of these shorter run fluctuations, there's some longer term trends in unemployment. And the stories that we develop, the models that we develop to explain these, has to really try to deal with that phenomenon as well. In fact, that's a very important phenomenon. It may help you determine whether there's a problem with economic policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy. Maybe it could be better. Maybe there was something better about it when unemployment had lower trends, and something bad when unemployment is higher. We need to think about that, but this is the material you look at to determine that. So now let's go to the second important variable, and that's the inflation rate. Inflation rate is defined as the percentage change in the price level in the economy. Hey, what's the price level? Well, price level is just an average of the price of all goods and services in the economy. Just take all the prices of bottled water or jewelry or apples, add up all the prices of that, give weights according to how much is spent on each item, of course, to measure its relative importance. And that kind of gives you an average price for the whole economy, of all the goods in the economy. It's called a price index. You can think of remember how nominal GDP doesn't control for increases in the overall price, but real GDP does. So you actually can think of a way to measure this price as just dividing nominal GDP by real GDP. That gives you a measure which we can consider and indeed will consider. Or you can think about what the government does to actually measure this price level. And this is something called the Consumer Price Index. There are government workers, surveyors who go around to grocery stores and various kinds of other retail stores and determine what the price is of different goods. And again, they measure that and add it up and weight it and get this Consumer Price Index. It's a price index or price level for the whole economy. Another measure. The inflation rate then is, as I see here and describe here, is the percentage change in the price level. So more particularly, it's the change in the price level divided by its previous value. So if capital P is the price level, then we subtract off the price in the previous period. That -1 means like the previous year or the previous quarter or the previous month, and to divide by the price in that previous quarter or month or year as well. And to get it to percentage terms, we just going to multiply by 100. So for example, if the price last year, P, the price index, was 100, and the change in the price from last year to this year was 2, then the P minus 1 over P minus 1 would be 0.2. We multiply by 100 and we get 2, and we'd say the inflation rate is 2%. Again, as the price index or the average price went from 100 to 102, that's an inflation rate of 2%. Now, given this definition, let's take a look at the inflation rate itself. This is a picture of the price level. The red line, you can see how it's rising over time because prices are higher and higher on average. And then the blue line is the percentage change in the blue line, in the red line. The percentage change in the red line gives you the blue line. And now the axes are representing these two things. So on the left you have the inflation rate, and on the right you have the price level. And you can see, if you look carefully, the period where prices were increasing quite rapidly. You can see how that line picks up before it slows down again. And that's exactly the period where you had tended to have higher inflation, because the rate of change, the percentage change each year, was higher in that period. And then more recently, it slowed down, and you can see that by the inflation rate itself. So that's the inflation rate. Again, remember, it's the percentage change in the average price level in the economy. This is another measure of the inflation rate that comes from this other index, the Consumer Price Index. It tells a very similar story. And once we're looking at this picture, you can also see how inflation is related to the ups and downs in the overall economy, to recessions and recoveries. So in particular, if you see inflation fell during that recession, inflation fell during that recession, inflation fell during and slightly after that recession, and the same here. And then it either stabilizes or starts to pick up. Here it picked up between the two. And so there's a relationship between inflation changes and whether there's a recession or a boom. It's not the only thing affecting inflation by any means, because there's also these trends in inflation. Inflation was much higher in this period than in this period, even though you had recessions, frequent recessions in that period. So we need to think about our macroeconomic models we're developing as both being able to explain how inflation fluctuates, but how there's also these trends over longer periods of time in the inflation rate. The third variable to consider is the interest rate. We've considered the interest rate by considering earlier bond prices, or what interest rate is on borrowing. And so there's really not a new thing to introduce here, but what we want to do is look at how the interest rate behaves as the economy goes up and down, recessions and recoveries, but also how it changes over time. So if you look at this picture, this is the interest rate. It's a very short-term interest rate. It's actually the overnight interest rate, what banks charge each other when they lend overnight. So it's very short term. It's not like a 10-year interest rate. It's not like a one-year interest. It's a one-day interest rate. It's kind of the shortest maturity that we can easily measure. And if you look at this picture, you also see a phenomenon that it moves relative to the recession. So the interest rate came down in that recession, came down in that recession. It's pretty regular. And it's sometimes going up in between. Here's an exception. The interest rate has stayed flat in between. We want to understand what's going on. We'll see that a lot of the movements in these interest rates have to do with monetary policy, have to do with what the central bank or the Fed does, but our model has to incorporate that in some way. And it's challenging, but we'll see we can do that. There's another thing in this picture. It's more than just those ups and downs in recessions. There's a longer-term trend up and a longer-term trend down in the interest rates. It's not unlike the longer-term trend up and down in the inflation rate, but we want to understand why that's the case too, and to consider whether you might have in the future an upward like that, or what exactly is going to occur, and how economic policy is going to be affecting that. And then finally, the fourth variable is the exchange rate. Any kind of economy, like the United States economy or the Japanese economy, European economy, is part of the world economy. And our macroeconomic models, whether it's of the United States or of Mexico or any country, has to reflect that. That's part of this general equilibrium idea that we need to focus on in macro. And one of the relationships between countries is the exchange rate. We already touched on one of the other relationships when we defined GDP. That was exports and imports of goods and services from other countries. But you'll see the exchange rate has big effects on those exports and imports and on other things. And it's also affected by monetary policy and fiscal policy. So we need to measure it to think what's going on. Exchange rate just is how much you have to pay for foreign currency, or how much foreigners have to pay for the US dollar if you want to exchange foreign currency for the dollar. This is a picture here, which is the example of the Japanese yen. It's really how many yen it takes to buy a dollar. That's the exchange rate, exchange from yen currency to US dollars. And you can see this has also moved over time. This is a picture that goes back into the 1970s. And on the vertical axis is the number of yen it takes to buy a dollar. And the number of yen it takes to buy a dollar has come down through this period. It came down especially large there in the 1980s. Been pretty stable since then, but even these kinds of movements are things that can affect the economy. There's not a strong relationship for this variable and the state of the economy as there is for others. It did come down in the most recent recession, but it went up in the recession before that. So the regularity that we've noted with respect to the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, and the interest rate is different here. And of course, one reason for that might be is these marks showing recessions are the US. And of course, there's another country involved when we're thinking about an exchange rate, and that's Japan. So it's going to depend not only what happens in the US, but what happens in other countries. Nonetheless, it's a very important macroeconomic variable, the fourth one that we need to bring into our picture somehow to explain what's going on. And you'll see we're now going to go from these measurements to actually models that describe the interaction between the ups and downs in the economy, the unemployment rate, the inflation rate, the interest rates, and the exchange rate. That'll be our objective as we develop models of the overall economy. Thank you.